Just like with thread, when it comes to needles, you have a lot of options to choose from. One of the first ones I consider is the size of the needle that I'm planning on using, and there's a large range. Needle sizes typically come in numbers like 75/11, 80/12. The one that I pay attention to is that first number, and that number is actually a measurement of the diameter of the needle. It's just in a scale that you might not be used to. It is in hundredths of a millimeter. So if I look at the diameter of this needle and I take some calipers, right there we can see that the diameter of my needle is 0.75 millimeters. So this is a 75/11 needle. So what do those numbers mean to me? Well, the smaller the number, the smaller the needle. Great, that works. The larger the number, the larger the needle. The other thing I want you to take away from that is, how do I use these? The smaller needles tend to be better for finer detail or thinner threads, smaller stitches. What I mean by that, so if I am trying to kind of push my limits and do things I probably shouldn't do in embroidery, like, I don't know, an 8-point stitch, not my best plan. Can I do it? Yes. Can I do it with an 80/12 needle? Probably not, because if I do an 8-point stitch with an 80/12 needle, if I'm doing, tenths of a point or hundredths of a millimeter, my needle and my stitch are the exact same size, and that's probably not going to end well for me. So when I'm dealing with smaller stitches, I need to be dealing with smaller needles. And I am serious when I'm saying, an 8-point stitch is probably not my best bet most of the time. Larger needles tend to be great for larger, thicker threads because they create a larger hole. That means less friction. So the downside of that is it can damage some of my finer materials. The downside of a smaller needle is that there's just less material there. It's not as strong. So if I need a stronger needle, I may go up a size. If I need a larger hole, I may go up a size. Finer detail, I may go down a size. It's just not quite as strong. Other things I may want to consider would be the point style. So what does the actual end of the needle look like? Is it sharp? Is it slightly rounded? Is it a little bit more rounded, or is it a lot rounded? And that's going to be kind of a range of anywhere between sharp to kind of a medium ballpoint. And the uses for these vary. Sharp needles tend to work well for very fine detail or very tightly woven materials. You start rounding things out and it starts moving threads out of the way as it's going through. RGs tend to be great for a wide range of embroidery. Light balls, medium balls, those you tend to use with a more open knit or a more open mesh to kind of move stuff out of the way. Beware though that at higher speeds that ballpoint can tend to damage some materials. So what do I use all the time? There isn't an answer for that. I tend to use RG most of the time, and then I will swap out as I need to. For needle size preference, most of the time I'm running middle of the range. I tend to run a 75 or a 70 most of the time, and then I'll move out of that when I have a specialty project or a specialty application. If I'm using a thicker thread or a more abrasive material where I need a bigger hole, I'll go up a size of needle. Finer detail, I go down a size. I tend to keep one or two of my needles on my machine at a smaller size needle anyway, pretty much all the time. And then if I'm running fine detail or small lettering, I will thread up the color for that element on whatever needle is the smallest one, and I will run that. Standard running time for a needle is 6 to 8 solid sewing hours. Now, I don't track that. I just don't know how long needle 2 has been constantly sewing. So I tend to run till they fail, and what that looks like is a burr or damage to my thread, damage to my material, I'm getting thread breaks, or the needle just completely fails and breaks itself. So that's what I tend to go on, and if I start having those symptoms, then I'll change my needle. It's not something that I track, with a stopwatch. It's just not how I operate. Now, there are other options than just your standard chrome needle. You can find a titanium coated needle, and that needle is stronger. It'll last 2 to 3 times as long, but it's not as flexible. So if you are running something that gives you a little bit of needle deflection, it may break with a titanium, whereas with a chrome, it may actually get through it. Now, a titanium needle will last 2 to 3 times as long. It doesn't typically cost 2 to 3 times as much, so you may choose to run with those a little bit more frequently. I like them because they are a little bit slicker, so if I'm doing anything with adhesive, it's not going to gum up on my needles as much. So if you're doing something like applique or tackle twill, I may choose to run with a coated needle. If you're doing something with a coating in the fabric itself, that too, a coated needle can help with that. Titanium needles are also kind of a gold color as opposed to the standard chrome. So if you look at my machine, you'll notice that I may have 1 or 2 that are a little bit different than others, and those I tend to use depending on their application. When selecting a needle, I'm going to be running a DBX-K5 needle. That's pretty much all the time. Now, there are exceptions where I will go to a DBX-K5 KK. What that is for me is the shank on the needle is shorter, the blade is a little bit longer, so the proportions are a little bit different. What that allows me to do is get through thicker materials, where if I were to use a normal needle as I'm going through, I start to kind of run out of room before that shank starts to push into the material. The shorter shank needle has a longer blade, it'll go through, but it's not actually changing the length of the needle, it's not changing the depth of the eye, it is just changing the proportions, but it allows you to get through some slightly thicker materials. Now you've got a ton of information about needles. Make your decisions based on what you are planning to do with your embroidery, and then adjust from there as need be based on your application.